one explains, the further one moves away from the self. The more one bends, translates, and dilutes their essence for another's comprehension, the more fragmented the psyche becomes. At its core, this over-explaining is a mask, not a theatrical one, flamboyant and obvious, but a subtle psychic adaptation, what one might call a persona. The persona is not inherently deceptive. It is a necessary tool for interacting with the external world. However, when the persona dominates the inner world, when it replaces genuine self-perception, it becomes a prison. The individual becomes a performer in their own life, offering versions of themselves tailored for others, hoping that if they explain enough, if they rationalize their feelings, their failures, their longing, someone will validate them. But in this effort, the authentic self is forgotten, like a voice drowned beneath layers of noise. The habit of explaining yourself begins early. As children, we are conditioned to believe that approval is earned by compliance, and that being accepted is the highest currency of safety. A child quickly learns that to be loved, they must make themselves understandable, agreeable, digestible. The wild, irrational, poetic elements of their being, the mystery of their dreams, the chaotic beauty of their emotions, are often dismissed, ridiculed, or pathologized. So they learn to filter, to hide, to explain only what fits into the framework that others can accept. This becomes the blueprint of identity, not who I am, but who I must be free to keep loving. This deeply rooted pattern follows many into adulthood, where the terrain becomes even more treacherous. In relationships, workplaces, social dynamics, the pressure to explain oneself becomes subtle but more persistent. Every action, boundary, or expression of individuality seems to require a justification. People begin apologizing for needing space, for being hurt, for saying no. They narrate their inner lives not to be understood, but to be excused. Let me explain why I am like this. They say, as if their very being must first pass through the court of collective judgment before it can be accepted. But the psyche cannot thrive under constant surveillance. The soul does not bloom in soil that demands an explanation for every root. When the self is constantly asked to justify its own inner truth, it either contorts itself or begins to atrophy. The individual who lives too long in explanation becomes alien to themselves. They are no longer acting from the center, from instinct or intuition, but from a carefully managed image. Every sentence is edited. Every feeling is examined for its potential to be misread. The joy of being oneself, the spontaneity of presence is replaced with the exhausting ritual of performing a palatable identity. There is also something inherently tragic in the compulsion to explain your pain. Pain, especially psychic pain, is not always logical. It is not a linear narrative. It is symbolic, often irrational, often rooted in unconscious material, far older than the moment it surfaces. To explain it too quickly is to reduce it, to strip it of its mystery, its depth, its ability to guide. When one is hurt and immediately moves to explain or defend that pain, they unconsciously invalidate it. They treat it as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be listened to. This robs the pain of its alchemical potential. Instead of leading to transformation, it becomes another performance, another apology, another layer of the mask. The over-explained self also keeps one in a perpetual loop of external validation. Every explanation is, in essence, a question. Do you understand me? Do you accept me? And even when the answer is yes, the relief is temporary. The ego is momentarily pacified, but the deeper self remains untouched. It knows that no amount of explanation will ever lead to true belonging. Belonging its truest sense is not granted by others. It is claimed by the individual who has come home to themselves. But this homecoming cannot happen through justification. It happens in the silence beneath the words, in the refusal to keep translating the soul into language that others can tolerate. This compulsive explaining also creates a hierarchy of truth. It implies that one's internal experience is not valid unless it can be articulated, unless it fits neatly into language and logic. But the psyche is older than speech. The unconscious does not speak in paragraphs. It speaks in symbols, images, moods, and movements. By demanding that everything be explained, the modern mind rejects the irrational, the mythic, the mysterious aspects of being. And yet, those are the very dimensions where healing occurs. Not in explanation, but in encounter. Not in logic, but in presence. To wear the mask of explanation for too long is to forget that you ever had a face beneath it. The more you explain, the more you conform to others' expectations of who you should be. Eventually, you may even begin to believe that mask issue. And when that happens, the path to healing disappears from you because it no longer exists, but because the one walking no longer remembers where they came from. Silence is often mistaken for absence, for a void where nothing happens. But in the language of the psyche, silence is not a gap. It is a threshold. It is the space between the surface and the depth, the seen and the unseen, where the unconscious begins to stir and reveal itself. When the outer noise fades and the compulsion to explain, justify, or perform is surrendered, a more ancient intelligence begins to speak. And this voice, unlike the voice of the ego, does not speak in sentences or declarations. It whispers in dreams, images, sensations, synchronicities. In a world saturated by information and constant verbal exchange, silence has become suspect. People often equate silence with discomfort or weakness. If someone falls silent, others rush to fill the gap, as though the quiet were an open wound in need of bandaging. But the true function of silence is not to be filled. It is to be entered. It is a container, a vessel into which the unconscious can pour its contents without interruption. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is a different mode of listening, one that moves vertically into depth rather than horizontally into noise. The unconscious does not respond to interrogation. It cannot be cornered or explained into revealing itself. It requires space, stillness, and time. When we fall silent, especially in times of inner conflict, grief, or transformation, we make room for the images and energies that dwell beneath the surface of awareness to rise. These are not random fragments but expressions of the deeper self, the part of us that holds the archetypal blueprint of our wholeness. They do not appear when summoned. They appear when we are quiet enough to notice them. In silence, the psyche begins to show its symbolic nature. We dream more vividly. We begin to notice recurring patterns or feel drawn to certain ideas, places, or symbols without fully understanding why. These are not coincidences. They are messages, not from some external oracle, but from within, messages encoded in the language of metaphor, image, and emotional resonance. In silence, what was unconscious begins to become conscious, not through force or effort, but through natural emergence. It rises like mist from a still lake, without sound but full of meaning. The ego, with all its plans, labels, and defenses, is profoundly uncomfortable with this. It prefers certainty and control, and it thrives on external input. But the ego cannot lead us into healing, because healing requires a descent. It requires the humility to not know, the courage to stop managing appearances, and the willingness to sit in the ambiguity of silence long enough for something real to emerge. This is why the descent into the unconscious has always been depicted as a journey into the underworld, into darkness, into a cave or a womb, not a place of death, but of rebirth, and birth does not come with noise. It comes in waves, contractions, breath, often in deep silence. The modern mind, trained to value productivity and clarity above all else, resists this space. It prefers distraction over depth, conversation over contemplation, movement over stillness. But what is forgotten in this frenzy is that the unconscious is not passive. It is not waiting for our permission to exist. It is always active, shaping our behaviors, desires, fears, and decisions from the background. The only question is whether we choose to listen to it consciously or allow it to govern our lives from the shadows. Silence is the threshold where this choice becomes possible. When one enters silence with intention, not as an escape, but as a descent, a different kind of awareness emerges. Time slows, the surface mind relaxes its grip, and something older begins to awaken. This is the beginning of true psychological work. One does not need a theory or a diagnosis to engage this process. One needs presence. One needs the discipline to wait in silence until the psyche begins to unfold its story, not as a linear plot, but as a tapestry of interwoven symbols, memories, and sensations that cannot be decoded through logic alone. The unconscious does not use words the way the conscious mind does. It speaks in the language of dreams, myth, body sensation, and emotional tone. Silence is the only atmosphere in which this language becomes intelligible. It is in silence that a sudden image appears during meditation. It is in silence that a memory surfaces, not with explanation, but with a feeling so profound it changes something foundational. It is in silence that one's body may begin to tremble, not from fear, but from the release of something stored for decades, something that could never have been put into words. This is not the silence of repression. It is not the silencing of voice or emotion. It is not the silence of avoidance. It is the silence of contact, of being so present with oneself that the layers of pretense and distraction fall away. In this silence, we may begin to meet the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have rejected, ignored, or disowned. But instead of analysis or explanation, the invitation is to witness, to hold, to allow. Silence is not a strategy, it is a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary, the unconscious finds the freedom to emerge and reveal what the busy, spoken world could never deliver. In this space, even suffering takes on new dimensions. It no longer demands immediate solutions or explanations. It asks to be heard, to be honored, to be allowed to complete its message. This is the wisdom of silence, not to cure, but to clarify, not to solve, but to deepen, not to erase pain, but to hold it in a way that transforms it from chaos into meaning. The unconscious is not accessed through louder voices or more convincing arguments. It is accessed through stillness, through quiet, through a reverence for what lives beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. Choosing yourself is not a slogan, not a momentary decision of defiance, and not merely an act of self-care. It is an initiation, often painful, often lonely, into the path of individuation. To choose yourself is to step away from the crowd and face the one question that most spend their lives avoiding. Who am I when I am no longer who others want me to be? This is not a question that can be answered quickly or easily. It is one that slowly unfolds in the psyche, drawing us inward toward the center of our being, toward the self, not the ego, not the mask, but the source from which the soul flows. The process of individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the pursuit of becoming better, more likable, or more acceptable by society's standards. It is the process of becoming who you already are at the deepest level. But this requires a turning away from the external mirrors in which you have tried to find your worth. It requires a withdrawal of energy from the roles you have played, the expectations you have tried to meet, and the applause you have craved. It requires a sacred rebellion, not against the world, but against the internalized voices that keep you tethered to a false self. Choosing yourself means honoring the quiet truth that lives beneath the noise. It means trusting the inner voice that says this is not for me, even when everyone else tells you it should be. It means saying no when your conditioning urges you to say yes, and it means walking away from what is familiar if it no longer nourishes your becoming. This choice is rarely convenient. It does not lead to instant rewards or external validation. In fact, choosing yourself may initially bring disorientation, isolation, or even grief, because it often requires shedding parts of your identity that were built for survival, not authenticity. The world is structured in such a way that conformity is rewarded and difference is quietly punished. From a young age, individuals are taught, directly and indirectly, that to be accepted, they must adapt. They must become what others can understand. They must suppress what is too intense, too strange, too inconvenient. The cost of this adaptation is subtle but profound. Over time, the individual forgets how to hear their own voice. They no longer know what they desire, only what is expected. Their choices are shaped by shoulds and obligations, not by instinct or imagination. The self, unchosen, recedes into the background. To choose yourself is to reverse this forgetting. It is to return to the original questions that once stirred in you before you were conditioned to ignore them. What do I love? What do I fear? What gives me life, not just purpose? These questions cannot be answered through logic alone. They require descent into the deeper layers of the psyche, where archetypes live, where the soul's blueprint remains untouched by social programming. Individuation is the slow integration of these layers into a coherent and embodied life. It is a movement inward and downward, not upward. It is not about rising above the world, but about descending into the truth of who you are beneath the world's gaze. Often, choosing yourself begins in crisis. Something breaks: the relationship, the career, the belief system, the identity you clung to, and you are left standing in the ruins, unsure of what remains. In that moment, you are given a choice. You can run back to the familiar, to the safety of performance and explanation, or you can stay with the uncertainty and begin listening to what is emerging. This is the moment the old self begins to die, not out of failure, but because it has fulfilled its role. The pain you feel is not a sign of something going wrong. It is a sign that something deeper is trying to be born. This process is not linear. It cannot be measured by external standards or timelines. There is no guarantee of clarity or comfort. At times, you may feel like you are losing your mind, but what you are actually losing are the false layers you once mistook for identity. The self does not speak in affirmations. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in patterns that repeat until they are recognized. To choose yourself is to begin translating this inner language, not for others, but for your own understanding. It is to become a student of your own soul. As you walk the path of individuation, you may find that the world becomes quieter. The invitations to perform, to explain, to justify begin to lose their power. You no longer need to be seen to feel real. You no longer need approval to feel whole. You begin to experience life not as something to master, but as something to participate in, with your full, unmasked self. This does not mean you become isolated or superior. On the contrary, it allows for deeper connection, because only when you have chosen yourself can you truly meet another. Anything else is a dance of projections. The act of choosing yourself also requires a confrontation with the shadow, the parts of you that you have denied or disowned in order to be acceptable. These may be your rage, your desire, your wildness, your grief. Individuation demands that these elements be integrated, not cast out. Only then can you live from a center that is whole rather than fragmented. Choosing yourself is not about becoming pure. It is about becoming complete. And completion does not look perfect. It looks real. It looks lived in. It carries the scars and the stories that make you human, and it does not apologize for them. Individuation is not a philosophy. It is a lived experience. It unfolds through relationship, through solitude, through art, through nature, through the body, and through suffering. Every time you choose yourself, especially when it is inconvenient or misunderstood, you deepen this process. You send a signal to the psyche that you are ready to live in alignment with your truth, even if that truth is still emerging. Choosing yourself is not an end point. It is the beginning of a long, sacred dialogue with the self, one that requires patience, humility, and a willingness to be changed by what you discover. Pain is rarely what it appears to be. On the surface, it may come cloaked in a specific event, a broken relationship, a betrayal, a loss, but underneath, pain speaks a symbolic language that cannot be decoded through ordinary explanation. When pain arises and we rush to understand it intellectually, to dissect it with logic or wrap it in justification, we often miss the deeper message it carries. The psyche does not suffer without meaning. Every wound, every ache in the soul, every recurring discomfort that defies simple explanation is trying to reveal something far older, far more archetypal than the story we tell ourselves about it. To sit with pain without explaining it is to enter a sacred space, one in which the rational mind is no longer in charge. This space is not familiar or comfortable. It is not ordered or easily navigated. It is the terrain of the unconscious, where time bends, where images and memories surface with no clear cause, where emotion seems to stretch beyond the limits of the present moment. Pain, when unexplained, acts as a bridge to this realm. It opens a portal to material that has been repressed, ignored, or forgotten, not only from personal memory, but from the deeper layers of the collective psyche. When we attempt to explain our pain too quickly, we often reduce it to a narrative that others can accept. We fit it into a context that makes sense within the limited framework of our conscious mind. But pain is not interested in making sense. It is interested in making contact. It wants to be felt in its fullness, not dissected. It wants to be seen as more than a problem to be fixed. It wants to be honored as a symbol, a messenger from within, asking for our attention, not our analysis. Pain that cannot be easily explained is often dismissed by the world. People are told to get over it, to look on the bright side, to find closure. But closure is a concept that belongs to the ego's desire for resolution, not to the soul's need for transformation. There are wounds that do not close in the conventional sense because they are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be integrated. They are meant to teach, to deepen, to strip away what is inauthentic. When pain is viewed as symbolic rather than simply circumstantial, it begins to take on meaning that cannot be reached through logic alone. The psyche stores its history in symbols, and pain is one of the most potent among them. A pain in the heart may not only be about recent grief. It may be connected to a long-standing pattern of abandonment that goes back decades. A chronic feeling of being unseen may have less to do with the current environment and more to do with a forgotten moment in childhood where the soul first learned to go silent in order to survive. These connections are not obvious at first. They require stillness, contemplation, and the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for its true shape to emerge. Unexplained pain often brings with it dreams, fantasies, and spontaneous imagery. A person may begin to dream of dark forests, broken houses, lost children, or unfamiliar faces that evoke a strange sense of recognition. These are not random. They are expressions of the unconscious, attempting to translate the pain into a form that the conscious mind can engage with, not through intellect, but through feeling and intuition. The more one resists these images, the more fragmented the inner experience becomes. But when one begins to treat them as meaningful, when they are held with curiosity and reverence, they start to reveal their message. This symbolic truth is not universal. Each person's pain speaks in a different dialect of the same deep language. What is crucial is not the content of the symbol, but the relationship one forms with it. To ask, "What is this pain trying to show me?" is not the same as asking, "How can I make it stop?" The former opens the door to insight, the latter slams it shut. Pain is not always meant to be cured. In many cases, it is meant to be lived with, to be worked through, to be carried like a sacred burden that reshapes the carrier into someone more whole, more aware, more awake. The modern mind, conditioned by instant answers and external solutions, finds this approach frustrating. But the soul is not in a hurry. It speaks in rhythms and patterns, in cycles and seasons. Pain, especially unexplained pain, is often cyclical. It returns not because we have failed to heal it, but because it is still offering something we have not yet received. Each time it arises, it may carry a slightly different message, a new layer of meaning. To meet it without the compulsion to name it, categorize it, or explain it away is to give it the space to fully express itself. Sometimes unexplained pain emerges as a deep existential longing, a hunger for something that cannot be found in the external world. It may feel like restlessness, like sorrow without a cause, like a yearning that refuses to be silenced. This type of pain is not a flaw in the psyche. It is a sign that the soul is awakening, stretching, calling the individual to live a life of greater depth and authenticity. It may demand that something be sacrificed, not externally, but internally. An identity, a belief, a way of being that no longer serves. This kind of pain is transformative, not because it vanishes, but because it changes the one who carries it. When pain is allowed to remain unexplained, it becomes a doorway rather than a dead end. It stops being an obstacle and becomes a teacher. This does not mean it becomes easier or less intense, but it becomes sacred. It takes its rightful place in the story of becoming, no longer a problem to solve, but a symbol to be lived through. The pain itself may not change, but the relationship to it does. And in that shift, something profound happens within the psyche. Something that cannot be achieved through explanation, only through encounter. Performance, authenticity is not found by declaring oneself to be authentic. It is not achieved through performance, imitation, or the accumulation of traits that appear genuine. Authenticity arises quietly beneath the layers of presentation and habit, when the compulsion to perform begins to dissolve. It is not a quality one acquires, but a presence that emerges when the masks fall away. In the absence of performance, when one no longer needs to be understood, admired, or accepted by others, a deeper self begins to appear, not crafted, not calculated, but simply present. From the earliest stages of life, individuals are shaped by a need to adapt. Approval becomes a currency and performance its method. The child learns quickly that love is not always unconditional. Love is often dependent upon compliance, achievement, politeness, or emotional suppression. As this pattern solidifies, the authentic self recedes into the background, often unrecognized, sometimes even feared. In its place, a performative identity forms, a mask that fits well in the outer world but feels increasingly alien inside. This mask may be admired, even praised, but it does not feed the soul. It starves it. Performance is exhausting. It is maintained through constant vigilance of tone, posture, expression, language. It requires the individual to remain alert to external cues, what others expect, what they value, what they reject. Over time, the boundary between the real and the performed self begins to blur. The individual forgets who they are without the audience. They no longer know how to exist without being perceived. Their actions are shaped not by inner necessity, but by outer demand. And yet, beneath this surface, the authentic self waits, unchanged, untouched, and quietly aware of the falseness of the role being played. To stop performing is to risk being seen for who one truly is, without embellishment, without defense. This is not easy. It may feel like exposure, like standing naked in a world that demands costumes. But this exposure is not weakness, it is clarity. When one stops performing, what is revealed is not imperfection, but truth, and truth, even when messy or inconvenient, carries an undeniable vitality. It is the presence of life unfiltered. The soul recognizes this kind of presence instantly. It resonates with it, not because it is flawless, but because it is real. Authenticity does not seek applause. It is not concerned with how it is received. It does not try to please, to provoke, or to impress. It simply is. It shows up raw, vulnerable, sometimes contradictory, always whole. It says what needs to be said, not what is expected. It stays silent when words would betray its integrity. It moves in accordance with inner rhythm, not out of schedule. To live this way is to invite misunderstanding. It is to walk a path that may be lonely at times, but it is also to be free, free from the tyranny of appearances, from the need to fit in, from the ache of disconnection that comes from never being fully oneself. When silence is allowed to replace the need for explanation, when space is created for stillness rather than performance, the authentic self has room to return. Its return is not dramatic. It does not shout or announce itself. It enters like a memory long buried, like the scent of something familiar yet forgotten. The first encounters with this self may be disorienting. It may seem strange, even uncomfortable, but slowly it begins to take shape, not as an idea or an ideal, but as a felt experience. It is the quiet confidence that arises when one no longer tries to be anything other than what they are. This emergence of authenticity is not a destination. It is a process, a continual unfolding. There is no final version of the true self, no ultimate arrival. The self is not static. It evolves, but it evolves from the inside out, not from the outside in. It grows in silence, in solitude, in those moments when one stops asking, "What do they want from me?" and begins to ask, "What is true for me now?" That question is a key. It opens a door that cannot be accessed through performance. Authenticity is deeply relational, but not in the conventional sense. It does not depend on being accepted by others. It depends on being related to oneself. When that inner relationship is strong, when one listens inwardly with the same attentiveness once reserved for external approval, then the outer relationships begin to change. Connections become more real, less dependent on mutual illusions. There may be fewer relationships, but the ones that remain are rooted in something enduring. There is no longer a need to convince, to persuade, to earn affection through effort. Presence becomes enough. The culture in which we live does not reward this kind of authenticity. It rewards visibility, marketability, conformity dressed as individuality. The authentic self, by contrast, does not always photograph well. It does not lend itself easily to branding or influence. It is often too nuanced, too quiet, too sincere for a world that thrives on spectacle. But it is precisely this refusal to perform that makes authenticity sacred. It cannot be sold or consumed. It can only be lived. To live authentically is to make peace with contradiction. The true self is not consistent in the way the ego desires. It contains multitudes. It may be joyful and melancholic in the same breath. It may hold opinions that do not align, longings that cannot be fulfilled, truths that shift with time. Authenticity is not about being right. It is about being real. It is about allowing the fullness of one's humanity to emerge without censorship. The moment performance ceases, the inner voice grows louder, not the voice of the inner critic, which is merely the internalized voice of society, but the voice of the self, the voice that says yes when it means yes and no when it means no. This voice may have been buried under years of performance. It may take time to hear it clearly, but it is always there, waiting, not demanding, not punishing, just waiting, waiting for the silence that allows it to be heard again, waiting for the space in which authenticity no longer needs to compete with performance, but can simply take its place as the ground from which life is lived. Healing does not begin in the noise of explanation, in the frantic attempts to justify one's existence, or in the endless search for approval. It begins in the stillness where performance is abandoned, where the self no longer contorts to be seen, understood, or accepted. In this silence, the psyche finds its natural rhythm again, one not dictated by external expectation, but by inner necessity. The act of choosing oneself again and again, even in solitude and discomfort, is the quiet revolution through which wholeness is restored. The pain that once seemed random begins to speak in symbols. The identity once shaped by adaptation begins to dissolve. The inner voice, long buried beneath the weight of survival, begins to rise, and in its rising, something ancient awakens, the self that has always been there, waiting for the moment you stop explaining and start listening. Healing is not the absence of wounds. It is the integration of what was once fragmented through presence, truth, and the radical act of becoming who you already are.